Thomas Brennan had learned to read Arizona winters with the skill of someone whose survival depended on accurate weather predictions. At 45, he had been managing his remote cattle ranch alone for a decade, and he took pride in his self-sufficiency and his ability to handle whatever challenges the harsh landscape presented. But the storm approaching from the north on that particular December evening looked severe even by his experienced assessment, the kind of blizzard that could kill cattle and humans alike if they were caught unprepared. He finished his preparations for the storm methodically, securing livestock in sheltered areas and bringing extra firewood close to his house, then settled in for what he expected would be several days of confinement while the weather exhausted its fury. The knock on his door came around midnight, so faint he almost dismissed it as wind-driven debris hitting the wooden frame. But something made him open the door to investigate, and he found himself staring at a sight that shocked him despite years of frontier experience. An Apache girl who looked to be in her early teens, her traditional clothing inadequate for the brutal cold, her lips blue, and her entire body shaking violently from hypothermia. She collapsed forward as the door opened, and Thomas's instincts overrode his usual caution as he caught her and dragged her inside away from the deadly wind. He worked quickly to address the immediate threat of freezing, wrapping her in blankets and positioning her near the fire, checking for frostbite on her exposed extremities, and making the medical assessments his isolated life had taught him to perform competently. She was conscious but barely, her eyes tracking his movements but unable or unwilling to speak. Thomas prepared warm broth, coaxing her to drink small amounts while her shivering gradually subsided from life-threatening violence to merely severe discomfort. Only when her condition had stabilized enough that immediate death seemed unlikely did Thomas allow himself to consider the complications her presence represented. An Apache girl alone in winter, desperate enough to seek help from a white rancher. Clearly running from something, the situation practically screamed trouble. Thomas knew he should probably ride for the nearest settlement once the storm passed and turn her over to authorities who handled such situations. But looking at her huddled by his fire, still trembling despite the blankets and the warmth, he found himself remembering his own daughter, the infant he had never really known, who had died hours after birth, taking his wife with her. The memory was old and usually well controlled, but something about this girl's vulnerability and desperation broke through his carefully maintained emotional distance. Over the next few days, as the storm raged outside and made travel impossible, Thomas learned fragments of her story through her improving English and his patient questions. Her name was Aita, which she said meant first to dance, and she was 14 years old. Her family had been part of a group relocated to reservation lands where conditions were deplorable. Inadequate food, contaminated water, and disease spreading unchecked through crowded quarters. Her parents and younger siblings had all died within weeks of arrival, and Aita had fled rather than wait for the same fate, preferring to risk death by exposure rather than certain death by staying. Thomas listened to her account with growing discomfort, recognizing that her story reflected larger injustices he had preferred to ignore as not his concern. He had known vaguely that reservation conditions were poor, had heard occasional complaints from travelers and traders, but he had never allowed himself to think deeply about what poor conditions meant in terms of actual human suffering. Aita's matter-of-fact description of watching her family die while officials provided no assistance, and no hope forced him to confront realities he had been avoiding through willful ignorance. As the storm finally began subsiding after 3 days, Thomas faced the decision he had been delaying, what to do with Aita now that travel was again possible. The proper course was clear: take her to authorities, report her circumstances, let official channels handle her situation. But Thomas found himself hesitating, recognizing that official channels would likely mean returning her to the same reservation conditions that had killed her family, or perhaps worse treatment for having fled. He asked Aita directly what she wanted, and her answer was simple and devastating. She wanted to live, wanted to work and earn her keep, wanted anything except going back to waiting for disease to claim her, like it had claimed everyone she loved. Thomas heard himself making an offer before he had fully thought through its implications. She could stay through the winter, could help with ranch work in exchange for room and board, and come spring they would reassess the situation. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a humanitarian gesture to get her through the dangerous season. But even as Thomas spoke the words, he suspected he was committing to something more permanent than he was admitting. Aita accepted immediately, relief evident in her expression, and Thomas felt simultaneously satisfied that he was doing something right and anxious about the complications her presence would inevitably create. Over the following weeks, Aita proved herself to be remarkably capable despite her age and the trauma she had endured. She learned Thomas's routines quickly, adapted to ranch work with the kind of determination that came from understanding her survival depended on being useful, and showed resilience that impressed Thomas despite his usual reluctance to be impressed by anything. She rarely spoke beyond what was necessary for coordinating work, seemed to understand that Thomas preferred quiet to constant conversation, and moved through the ranch with an efficiency that made her presence feel less like an intrusion and more like a surprisingly functional addition to his operations. Thomas found his own routines shifting to accommodate Aita's presence in ways he hadn't anticipated. He started preparing actual meals rather than just eating whatever was quickest, began maintaining the house with more care since someone else was living in it, and discovered he was gradually emerging from the isolation that had defined his existence since his wife's death. The changes were subtle but accumulating, and Thomas wasn't entirely sure how he felt about the erosion of the solitary life he had carefully constructed as protection against further loss and disappointment. One evening, about a month after Aita's arrival, Thomas was working on repairing a harness, while Aita sat nearby mending a tear in one of his work shirts. The comfortable silence that had developed between them was broken when she spoke quietly. "Thank you for not sending me away, for giving me a chance when you didn't have to," Thomas responded awkwardly, saying he was just following basic human decency, but Aita shook her head. She told him that most people would have turned her over to authorities without a second thought, that his willingness to see her as a person, rather than just as a problem or a category, deserved real acknowledgement. The conversation unsettled Thomas, forcing him to recognize that his decision to help Aita had meant more than he had wanted to admit. He had told himself he was just being practical, just ensuring adequate labor for the winter season. But Aita's gratitude made him confront that he had actually made a choice based on compassion and on recognition of shared humanity. He wasn't sure he wanted to be the kind of person who made such choices. It was safer and simpler to remain detached, to keep everyone at emotional distance, to avoid the vulnerability that caring created. But looking at Aita's serious expression and her obvious sincerity, Thomas found himself unable to maintain the fiction that his help had been purely transactional or temporary. As winter deepened and months accumulated, the temporary arrangement between Thomas and Aita evolved into something that felt increasingly permanent, despite neither explicitly acknowledging the shift. Aita had moved beyond simply helping with basic chores to becoming genuinely skilled at ranch operations, managing livestock care with competence that equaled or exceeded Thomas's own abilities in some areas. She brought knowledge from her Apache upbringing about reading animal behavior, about treating common ailments with local plants, about working efficiently in harsh conditions, skills that complemented Thomas's more conventional ranching expertise, and that improved their combined operations. The ranch itself showed signs of their partnership, functioning with a smoothness it hadn't achieved during Thomas's solitary management. Tasks that had been neglected or performed inadequately because Thomas lacked time or energy were now completed properly. The property looked more maintained, animals were healthier, and productivity improved in measurable ways. Thomas found himself taking satisfaction in these improvements and in working alongside someone whose competence he respected, even as he remained wary of acknowledging how much Aita's presence had improved not just his ranch but also his daily existence. They developed patterns of interaction that worked for both their personalities, Thomas's preference for quiet and Aita's respect for his need for silence meant they could work together for hours without speaking, communicating through gestures and glances when necessary. But they also began having conversations during evening meals, discussions that started with practical ranch matters but gradually expanded to more personal topics. Aita told Thomas more about her life before the reservation, about Apache traditions and values, about the world she had lost. Thomas found himself reciprocating, sharing memories of his wife and the daughter he had never known, talking about griefs he had kept locked away for a decade. These conversations created intimacy that Thomas found both comforting and frightening. He had protected himself through isolation, through maintaining emotional distance from everyone, through refusing to allow anyone close enough to matter. Aita's presence was eroding that protection, and Thomas wasn't sure whether to be grateful for the connection or resentful of the vulnerability it created. He caught himself worrying about her welfare, noticing when she seemed troubled or tired, adjusting his own behavior to accommodate her needs, all signs of caring that he had thought he had successfully eliminated from his emotional repertoire. One significant moment came when Thomas's nearest neighbor, a rancher named Collins who lived 20 miles east, stopped by and discovered Aita's presence. Collins was skeptical and somewhat hostile, questioning whether Thomas understood the risks he was taking by harboring an Apache runaway, suggesting that authorities wouldn't view the arrangement favorably, and implying that Thomas's judgment might be impaired by loneliness or by inappropriate attraction to a young girl. Thomas's response was immediate and forceful. He told Collins that Aita was his employee, that her work was excellent, that her presence was nobody's business but his own, and that Collins needed to leave immediately. After Collins departed, Aita thanked Thomas for defending her, but also expressed concern that his support might cost him socially or economically, that neighbors might retaliate by refusing to trade or cooperate with someone who openly defied conventions about proper relations between whites and Apaches. Thomas dismissed her concerns with more confidence than he felt, insisting that he had never cared much about neighbors' opinions and wasn't going to start now. But privately, he recognized that Aita was right to worry. His defense of her presence had been noticed, and there would likely be consequences he couldn't yet predict. As spring approached and the time neared when Thomas had originally suggested they would reassess the situation, both of them seemed to avoid discussing what that reassessment might conclude. Thomas had long since abandoned any real intention of sending Aita away, but he hadn't explicitly told her that her place on the ranch was permanent if she wanted it. Aita, for her part, clearly wanted to stay but seemed afraid to push for explicit commitment in case Thomas rejected her. They existed in a kind of limbo, both understanding that the temporary arrangement had become something more but neither quite ready to name it or make it official. The turning point came during a difficult calving when one of Thomas's best cows was struggling with a breech birth that threatened both her life and the calf's. Thomas and Aita worked together through the night, both of them focused completely on saving the animals through a delivery that required skill, strength, and calm determination. When they finally succeeded, pulling the calf free and watching the cow recover, they sat exhausted but satisfied in the barn, covered in blood and other fluids, and Thomas felt something shift in how he viewed their relationship. He told Aita that she had done excellent work, that her skills and her composure under pressure had probably made the difference between success and losing both animals, and that he was genuinely impressed by her capabilities. Aita accepted the praise with quiet satisfaction, then spoke with uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Does this mean I can stay? Not just until spring, but really stay?" The question hung between them, and Thomas recognized it as the moment when he needed to make an actual decision, rather than continuing to postpone difficult choices through vague temporizing. Thomas answered honestly, "Yes, you can stay. This is your home now as much as it's mine, for as long as you want it to be." The commitment felt enormous as he spoke it, felt like a betrayal of his decade-long determination to remain emotionally uninvolved with anyone. But it also felt right in a way Thomas couldn't quite articulate. Felt like he was finally acknowledging truth rather than maintaining comfortable fiction. Aita's relief was palpable, and Thomas saw her visibly relax as if she had been carrying tension she could finally release. In the weeks that followed, with their arrangement now explicitly permanent rather than temporary, subtle changes occurred in how they related to each other. Aita became more willing to express opinions about ranch decisions rather than simply deferring to Thomas's judgment. Thomas found himself actively consulting her about planning and operations, recognizing that her perspective and knowledge were valuable assets rather than just viewing her as helpful labor. They were functioning more as partners than as employer and employee, and Thomas discovered he preferred this dynamic, even though it represented a level of equality and mutual dependence that made him more vulnerable than he had been in years. Spring arrived fully, transforming the Arizona landscape from winter brown to vibrant green and bringing the usual seasonal demands of ranch maintenance, cattle management, and preparation for the challenges of summer heat. Thomas and Aita worked through these transitions with practiced efficiency, their partnership now so well established that they rarely needed to discuss tasks explicitly. Each understood their roles and responsibilities, adjusted to changing circumstances, and supported the other's work without requiring constant coordination or instruction. But as comfortable as their working relationship had become, Thomas remained aware that significant aspects of their situation remained unresolved. Aita was now 15 and approaching an age when questions about her long-term future would become more pressing. She had no legal status in his household, no official protection if authorities decided to investigate her presence, and no formal claim to the ranch or its operations despite her substantial contributions. Thomas knew he should address these issues, but found himself avoiding the conversations they would require, partly because he wasn't sure what solutions existed, and partly because discussing the future meant acknowledging feelings he had been trying not to examine too closely. One particular morning, Thomas woke before dawn as usual and went outside to begin his daily routines. He found Aita already up, sitting on the porch watching the eastern sky lighten from black to deep blue, to the first hints of orange that preceded sunrise. She turned when she heard him, and her expression was serious in a way that immediately put Thomas on alert. Something was clearly weighing on her mind, and he had learned that Aita rarely looked troubled unless she was dealing with genuinely significant concerns. She gestured for him to sit beside her, which he did, and they watched the sunrise together in silence for several minutes before Aita finally spoke. She told Thomas she had been thinking about her situation, about what her presence on his ranch meant, and about how precarious her position actually was. She acknowledged that he had been incredibly kind and that she was deeply grateful, but she also recognized that their informal arrangement provided no real security for either of them. If he changed his mind, she would have no recourse. If authorities challenged her presence, neither had legal standing to resist. If something happened to him, she would have no claim to remain on the property she had helped improve. Thomas listened with growing discomfort, recognizing that Aita was articulating concerns he had been deliberately avoiding. Before he could respond, she continued with words that would alter everything between them. "I know I'm just a girl you found half frozen who stayed longer than either of us planned, but you've become my family. This ranch has become my home. You're my home now, Thomas, in every way that matters. And I need to know if that means anything to you, or if I'm just convenient labor you'll eventually send away when circumstances change." The directness of her statement, the vulnerability in her voice, as she essentially asked whether he cared about her beyond her usefulness, left Thomas momentarily speechless. He had spent a decade avoiding exactly this kind of emotional exposure, had structured his entire existence around not caring about anyone enough that their loss could devastate him again. Aita's declaration forced him to confront that his careful defenses had failed completely. He did care about her deeply in ways that went far beyond employer to employee or even friendly partnership. She had become family without his permission or intention, and her potential loss would hurt in ways he had thought he would never risk experiencing again. Thomas struggled to find words adequate to his feelings, finally settling on honesty, even though it required admitting things he had barely acknowledged to himself. "You're not just convenient labor. You haven't been that for months, maybe never were. He paused, searching for the right description. "You're my family too, the daughter I never got to raise. The family I thought I'd lost forever. This ranch is your home because you made it a home again instead of just a place where I existed." Aita's eyes filled with tears, and Thomas found his own vision blurring, emotions he had suppressed for years overwhelming his usual control. They sat together as the sun fully rose, both of them processing the significance of what had just been acknowledged, both recognizing that they had just transformed an informal arrangement into something with real emotional weight and lasting commitment. Finally, Ayita asked the practical question that followed from their emotional declarations. So what do we do now? How do we make this real instead of just something we feel, but that has no legal standing? Thomas had been researching this question privately for weeks, had consulted discreetly with a lawyer in a distant town, and had learned about the process of legal guardianship that would give their relationship official status. He explained to Ayita that he could file for formal guardianship, claiming her as his ward and taking legal responsibility for her welfare and upbringing. The process would require testimony, documentation, and navigating prejudices about Apache children and white guardians, but the lawyer thought it was achievable if Thomas was committed to persisting through inevitable obstacles. Ayita asked if Thomas really wanted to take on that legal responsibility, to formally claim her as family rather than just continuing their informal arrangement. Thomas's answer was unequivocal. Yes, I want it official. I want you protected legally, not just by my good intentions. I want you to have real claim to this place that's become yours through your work and your presence. I want... He paused again, then continued, I want to be your father, if you'll accept that. The word father hung in the air between them, representing a relationship Thomas had thought would never apply to him after his infant daughter died. Ayita's response was immediate. She hugged him fiercely, something she had never done before, and said quietly, You've been my father in every way except the name for months now. Making it official just means the rest of the world has to recognize what we already know. The guardianship process took several months of bureaucratic navigation, testimony from Thomas and from several character witnesses who could vouch for his fitness as guardian, and persistent effort to overcome official skepticism about the arrangement. But eventually, the legal relationship was established, giving Ayita official status as Thomas's ward and giving Thomas formal responsibility for her care. More importantly, the process gave Ayita legal protections. She could no longer be simply taken by authorities and returned to reservation conditions. She had claim to inheritance rights if something happened to Thomas, and she had legal standing to remain on the ranch that had become her home. With the legal relationship formalized, other aspects of their situation became easier to manage. Thomas enrolled Ayita in correspondence education that would give her equivalent schooling, despite living too remotely for traditional school attendance. He began teaching her not just ranch operations, but also the business and property management knowledge she would need if she eventually inherited and operated the ranch herself. He introduced her to his lawyer, his banker, and other professionals who might be useful allies as she navigated a world that would always view her with some suspicion because of her Apache heritage. Years passed, and the ranch continued prospering under their joint management. Ayita grew into a capable young woman, whose competence at ranching was matched by her intelligence and her increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to navigate between Apache and white worlds. She maintained connections to her cultural heritage through occasional visits with Apache families in the region, who had heard about her situation and respected both her choices and the white rancher who had accepted her as daughter. She helped Thomas engage more thoughtfully with Apache communities, serving as bridge and translator between groups that rarely communicated constructively. When Thomas eventually became too old for heavy physical work, Ayita assumed primary responsibility for ranch operations while ensuring he remained involved in decision-making and felt valued despite his reduced physical capabilities. She married, had children, and created a multi-generational family on the ranch that Thomas never could have imagined during his decade of isolated grief. He lived long enough to see his grandchildren, children of mixed heritage who carried both Apache and white bloodlines, and who would grow up learning to honor both aspects of their background. In his final years, Thomas often thought about that dawn when Ayita had spoken those words that had changed everything. "You're my home now." The simple declaration had forced him out of emotional isolation he had been using as shield against further loss, had challenged him to risk caring again, despite knowing how much caring could hurt. He had accepted that challenge, had opened his heart to the possibility of family despite every protective instinct arguing against such vulnerability, and in doing so had discovered that his life's second half could be richer and more meaningful than his first. When Thomas died peacefully at 71, surrounded by Ayita and her family, his last thoughts were of gratitude for the half-frozen Apache girl who had knocked on his door one winter night and who had somehow saved him from the slow emotional death of complete isolation. Her declaration of belonging, that he was her home, had given him permission to acknowledge that she had become his home too, his family, his reason for caring about the future beyond his own survival. Two damaged people had found each other through circumstances neither had sought, and through that finding had created a family built not on blood, but on choice, commitment, and the recognition that sometimes the most important homes are the ones we build intentionally, with people who need us as much as we need them. Ayita continued operating the ranch for many more years, teaching her children and grandchildren the lessons both she and Thomas had learned. That family meant people who chose to care for each other regardless of background or origin. That home was created through mutual commitment and shared work, rather than simply inherited through birth, and that sometimes the most profound declarations were the simplest ones. "You're my home now," spoken with absolute certainty by someone who had finally found where they belonged.